Outside, the storm was howling. The wind screamed in violent gusts as if trying to rip the roof off, and the rain lashed against the window panes with the fury of nature unleashed. In the small house at the end of a quiet street in Carterville, the lights flickered twice, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed everything, but what was about to happen inside that house was even more terrifying than the storm raging outside. Lieutenant Rebecca Becky Lawson, 58 years old, a retired Marine Corps officer, lay sprawled across the icy hardwood floor of her living room. One arm was twisted at an unnatural angle. The left side of her face was frozen, her mouth half open, trying to say something, but no sound came out. Her entire body trembled. As her wide, disoriented eyes locked onto the ceiling, her breath came in panicked gasps. The stroke struck suddenly, brutal and silent, like a sniper in the dark. 1 minute ago, Becky had been grading her students' assignments, just another ordinary evening. The next minute, her body betrayed her. The pain didn't come from a physical injury, but from the absolute helplessness. Her mind was still aware, but her body had already fallen into a state of half-death. There was only one witness and the only glimmer of hope left for Becky Atlas, her service dog. A loyal Malinois who always lay quietly by her side, as steady and silent as a sentry on duty. No panic, no frantic barking like a typical dog. Atlas responded just as he was trained to, and more. His nose twitched as he checked Becky's scent. Then his eyes darted to the vest hanging nearby, the one with the emergency device clipped to it. A device that had never been used before, only to be pressed in the worst-case scenario. And today was that day. With a firm press from his front paw, Atlas hit the red emergency button. A short beep sounded, then silence. No response signal. No confirmation tone, and Atlas knew that was not normal. The power was out, the network was down. The emergency device, once considered a lifeline, was now nothing more than a useless piece of plastic. Becky still lay there unmoving, her eyes blurry, but still trying desperately to follow Atlas with what little focus she had left. Her chest rose and fell erratically, each breath sharp like blades slicing through her throat. Atlas stepped back. A low growl rumbled from his throat, not fear but determination. Plan B. The dog spun around and bolted to the front door. Becky had thoughtfully installed a lever-style handle specifically so Atlas could open it if necessary. With a swift jump, Atlas leapt up, pressed both front paws against the handle, then shifted his weight forward. The door burst open and wind and rain flooded the house like a tidal wave. Without a second's hesitation, Atlas darted outside. Rain battered his body, his fur soaked within seconds. A flash of lightning tore through the sky, briefly illuminating the road ahead, and a bobbing flashlight from across the street. It was Sandra Lewis, Becky's neighbor, hurriedly pulling in her laundry before the storm took it away. Atlas ran straight toward her, barking 3 times, pause, then 3 more. The signal Becky had trained him with, a signal never used outside of drills. Sandra turned startled. "What's going on, Atlas?" she murmured, glancing around. No sign of Becky. No lights on in her window like usual. Then it hit her. Atlas wasn't wearing his vest. It was pouring rain, and most of all, he never left Becky's side unless something was terribly wrong. A chill ran down Sandra's spine. "Becky!" she yelled toward the pitch-black house across the street, but no answer came. Atlas barked again, then turned and sprinted back. Sandra followed, a rising sense of dread curling in her gut, not from the storm, but from the unshakable feeling that something was horribly, horribly wrong. When she stepped into Becky's living room, Sandra froze. There on the floor, the woman once known in her unit as the Iron Valkyrie now lay motionless. Her eyes were glazed, her mouth distorted by the stroke. Sandra gasped in horror and dropped to her knees. Becky was still breathing, but so faint, so shallow, it was barely perceptible. Atlas snorted and pushed the emergency vest towards Sandra. She spotted the device, its light completely dead. She pressed every button she could, nothing. "Damn it!" Sandra cried out, tears suddenly spilling from her eyes. She grabbed her phone. No signal, no more options. She grabbed the whole vest, turned to Atlas. "Stay with her. I'll be back," she shouted, her voice breaking. Sandra ran through the pouring rain, thunder cracking like explosions overhead. She dashed down 2 blocks toward the fire station, waving her arms frantically. Inside the station, after a few chaotic minutes and a desperate plea, an emergency team was deployed via their radio system. Within 20 minutes, Becky was on a stretcher, being rushed into an ambulance. Atlas stood beside her like a stone statue, unmoving, his eyes never leaving his handler, his partner, his lifeline. The one soul in this world that mattered most. There were no ambulance sirens echoing through Rebecca, Becky Lawson's memory. No flashing lights, no hurried footsteps. Instead, there was only darkness, thick and endless, like the muddy trenches of Helmand Province where she had once buried her fallen comrades. And in that abyss, the only thing tethering her to life was the steady sound of breathing and the vigilant gaze of Atlas. She had once jokingly called Atlas her backup bloodstream during their early days at the military K-9 training camp. But she had never imagined that this very dog would be the only reason she survived a catastrophic stroke. The ambulance sped through the rain-soaked streets of Carterville, slicing through flooded intersections like a vessel in a storm. In the back, Becky was hooked up to life support equipment, her face ashen, her heartbeat, erratic pupils twitching. But no one in the vehicle noticed that the real gatekeeper between life and death sat silently in the corner. Atlas, drenched to the bone, eyes locked on Becky's face without blinking once. One medic turned and asked the driver, "Why's this dog staring at her like that?" The driver didn't take his eyes off the road. Heard he once saved her from an IED blast in Kandahar. Maybe he's guarding her again? Atlas didn't understand those words, but he could feel Becky's biochemistry in chaos, and to him, that meant one thing: danger inside the emergency room as doctors swarmed in like a tactical unit. Atlas was restrained just outside the doors, his leash tied to a railing. He didn't bark, he didn't resist, but his eyes radiated warning. Nurse Kim, who had always been wary of dogs, stepped past him and instinctively pulled back. "I swear, it's like he knows exactly what's happening in there," she whispered. Inside Dr. Marcus. Wheeler, a weathered former military medic, glanced at the patient intake sheet. Rebecca Lawson. His hand froze in midair. "Lawson," he murmured. Broken memories surfaced: dust, helicopters, and a female officer screaming as she pulled a bloodied body from the rubble. That was Becky. "Oh my God," he whispered, then steadied himself. "I'm Dr. Wheeler. You're at Mercy General. You've had a stroke, but we're still within the window. We're going to do everything we can." Becky couldn't reply, but outside the doors, Atlas was still there. Waiting in the hallway, Sandra Lewis, the neighbor who once rolled her eyes at Becky's 6 a.m. training sessions, now sat slumped on a bench, head in her hands. Her palms were still damp from the rain, but the tremble in her body wasn't from the cold. It was from the realization that the woman she thought was indestructible was not. When the nurses finally allowed a brief visit, Atlas let out a low growl, not threatening, but firm. A reminder: be careful, she's still fighting. Sandra nodded solemnly. "I know I'll fight beside her just like you." The first 3 days were hell. Becky remained unconscious, mild brain swelling, no speech, total paralysis on her left side. But every night, Atlas climbed onto her hospital bed, placed his head gently on her functioning right arm, and breathed slowly like a vow of loyalty, spoken without words. A resident whispered one night, "He just sits there like a soldier on watch." On the 4th day, Becky opened her eyes, not fully awake but focused, and when she saw Atlas, a single tear slipped down her cheek. Atlas wagged his tail. Just once, but he didn't bark. Not yet. He knew she wasn't ready, but he also knew she's coming back. By the 2nd week, Becky began typing with her right hand, the only way she could communicate. Her first question, typed on the hospital tablet: "Is Atlas okay?" Sandra nearly choked on emotion as she replied, "He didn't eat for 2 days. The nurses had to hide pieces of steak in his vest." Dr. Wheeler stepped in, then nodding. "We've made special arrangements. Atlas is officially authorized to attend every therapy session with you." Becky typed, "Good. He's the only one who understands me." One morning, while a nurse took Atlas for a quick walk around the hospital courtyard, a stranger reached out to pet him. Atlas turned sharply, growled a low guttural sound, and stepped back, eyes locked on the man's face. Startled, the man retreated. "Geez, that dog's intense." Nurse Kim, now oddly protective of Atlas, replied coldly, "He's a soldier. He knows who's trustworthy and who's not." Later that day, during her first physical therapy session, Becky attempted to stand using the parallel bars. Sweat poured down her forehead. Her left leg trembled, then gave out completely. "Careful!" the therapist shouted, rushing to catch her. Becky slammed her right fist against the metal bar, not from pain, but from fury. She grabbed her tablet and typed, "I didn't fail, I just haven't won yet." From the end of the hallway, Atlas stood up, patted over, and gently rested his head on her thigh. And for the first time since regaining consciousness, Becky laughed, a tired, bitter, yet defiant laugh. There are battles without bullets, without medals, without comrades. But Becky wasn't alone. She had Atlas, not just a service dog, not just a PTSD companion. He was her last soldier. He stayed when her body betrayed her, when the world went silent, when every cry went unanswered. He was the living memory of her time in uniform. He was the symbol of unyielding loyalty, and now he was the reason she believed she would rise again. House number 27 at the end of Maple Lane had always given Sandra Lewis an uneasy feeling, not because of Rebecca Lawson herself, but because of how starkly different they were. Sandra, a 44-year-old divorced office worker, cherished peace and quiet. She hated noise, avoided confrontation, and preferred to keep her world neatly contained. Becky, as everyone called her, was the embodiment of military discipline: early morning jogs, intense physical workouts, dog training drills, and mowing the lawn, exactly at 6 a.m. every Saturday. Her arrival, along with a sharp-eyed Malinois that patrolled like a World War II sentry, had shattered the serene atmosphere Sandra had carefully cultivated for years. In the 2 years they had lived next to each other, their exchanges had never gone beyond a few polite greetings. Sandra never initiated conversation. She didn't like the sound of military boots on Becky's front porch, and she certainly didn't appreciate the way Atlas always seemed to scrutinize her with tactical suspicion. But on that fateful night when Becky lay unconscious in the dark and Atlas howled into the rain like a soul torn open, Sandra became the main character in a story she had never wanted to enter. That rainy night when Sandra first heard Atlas's strange rhythmic barking, her initial instinct was to ignore it, but something gut instinct of unease, or perhaps something more intangible, made her turn around, and Atlas's eyes made her heart skip a beat. Not angry, not panicked, but pleading, desperate and urgent. She ran across the street, drenched within seconds. When she entered Becky's house, she froze on the threshold. Lightning flickered through the window, illuminating the hardwood floor. In Becky's unmoving body, why me? The question flashed through Sandra's mind. She wasn't a hero, she was just a neighbor, a middle-aged woman with a guarded heart. But in that moment, all of her walls crumbled. She rushed to Becky's side, screamed her name, shook her, and tried the emergency device Atlas had nudged toward her, but nothing worked. Power was out, the network was down. The world itself seemed to conspire with the darkness. "I have to get help. Stay with her, Atlas. Watch over her," she shouted, then sprinted out the door carrying the vest, her shoes sinking into puddles in a fear she had never known before. The fear that she might be too late. Sandra never imagined she'd one day be sitting in a hospital hallway soaked and tear-streaked, waiting on news about a neighbor she once considered filing a noise complaint against for mowing the lawn too early. When Dr. Wheeler finally came out, his face was tense but not hopeless. "We administered TPA in time to dissolve the clot. She still has a chance, but we'll need to monitor her closely." Sandra gripped her hands. "What about Atlas?" "We've allowed him to stay close. It seems she needs him more than anyone else." Sandra nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Something inside her had shifted. For the first time in years, she wasn't standing outside someone else's life. When Becky regained consciousness, Sandra was there. She didn't go into the room. Just watch from behind the glass. Watched a woman who had survived war, now battling her own body. She saw Atlas place his head gently on the hospital bed, saw Becky's right hand slowly type the first words. Has he been here the whole time? A nurse nodded. Hasn't moved an inch. Sandra stepped inside, unsure of what to say. She sat down and reached for Becky's hand, a gesture that surprised even herself. You're okay now. I came back like I promised, and Atlas, he's a true soldier. Becky typed, I thought you hated me. Sandra gave a small smile. Not hate, I just never understood someone like you until I saw you lying there alone in that storm. They sat in silence. Only the sound of IV drips and Atlas's steady breathing filled the room. In the days that followed, Sandra visited often, not out of obligation, but because of something unspoken that had formed between them. She began chatting with nurses, learning about rehab, and even took Atlas on walks while Becky rested. And it was Atlas, with his intelligent gaze and unwavering loyalty, who quietly reshaped how Sandra saw the world and herself. One day, as Sandra bent to place a water bowl near Atlas, he gently licked her hand. A small gesture, but enough to melt years of emotional ice. He's accepted me, Sandra whispered to Becky. Becky typed, he doesn't trust easily, but I think he sees something good in you. Sandra chuckled. Maybe I'm learning how to be a better person. One evening, Becky failed during a rehab exercise, unable to stand, collapsing to the floor. She screamed, not in pain, but in rage and helplessness. A nurse rushed for help. Sandra heard the commotion and ran in. Atlas was already there, growling low, pacing nervously. Becky lay curled on the mat, her eyes red and wild. Sandra said nothing. She simply sat down and wrapped her arms around Becky. A clumsy embrace, but real. You're not alone, Sandra whispered. I'm here. Atlas is here. This whole team is here. You don't have to fight alone anymore. Becky typed with shaking fingers. I don't know how to do that. Sandra nodded. Then learn with me. The storm from that night had passed, but a new one, quieter, longer, and deeper still, raged inside Becky's body and soul. This time, though, she wasn't facing it alone. And in that long road ahead, Sandra, the once distant neighbor, had become an untrained comrade, chosen not by duty but by heart. When Marcus Wheeler stepped into the emergency room that night, he didn't expect to see a familiar name, a name he had locked away in the darkest corners of his memory long ago. Rebecca Lawson. The bolded letters on the patient monitor made him freeze for a second. His heart clenched, not from the pressure of the job, but because a flood of memories came crashing in. The roar of helicopter blades, the acrid scent of scorched earth shouted commands in the chaos, and the bloodied, furious face of a female officer dragging her teammate out of the rubble in Kandahar. It was her. Wheeler shook off the wave of emotion in that single brief second and stepped into the room with the composure of a seasoned physician. But deep down, he knew this was no ordinary patient. This was a warrior, a woman who wouldn't surrender, not even to her own body. Rebecca had been admitted to the ICU in critical condition. The stroke had paralyzed much of the left side of her brain, and time was of the essence. Wheeler had just 60 seconds to decide should they administer TPA, a powerful clot-busting drug, effective but risky. We're still within the golden hour, but there's a chance of a hemorrhage, a young resident whispered. Wheeler didn't hesitate. Administer it. She's a Marine. If there's anyone who can survive a war against her own blood, it's Lawson. 3 hours later, her vitals began to stabilize, but Becky remained unconscious. Wheeler stood outside the glass window, arms crossed, eyes quiet, as if waiting for an unspoken order from a commanding officer no one else could hear. Beside the bed, Atlas lay with his head resting on the bed rail, eyes never leaving his handler. The sight tightened something in Wheeler's chest. You haven't left her side once, have you? He whispered, then turned away. The next morning, Wheeler returned. When he entered the room, Becky was still unconscious, but her eyelids twitched slightly. He placed his stethoscope over her chest. Steady heartbeat. Her eyes slowly opened. There were no words, just awareness. Wheeler spoke gently. Lawson, I'm Dr. Wheeler. You're at Mercy General. You suffered a stroke, but you are past the critical stage now. We need to work together from here." She tried to move her lips, only garbled sounds came out, fragmented and unintelligible. Wheeler understood. He sat down and placed a communication board in front of her. "We'll use this until your speech returns. Take it slow, I'm not in a hurry, and Atlas is here." A faint flicker lit up in Becky's eyes. She blinked twice as a nod. In the days that followed, Becky had to relearn everything. Raising her arm, gripping objects, sitting up, and finally attempting to stand. Basic instincts had become survival-level challenges. Wheeler monitored every session closely. He was present at every physical therapy appointment, not because the protocol required it, but because something inside him needed to witness this. Rebecca Lawson would not be defeated. Not by the Taliban, not by bullets, and certainly not by a stroke. During the 6th therapy session, Becky fell hard to the floor. The sound echoed, freezing the room. Nurses rushed to her, but Becky motioned with her hand. "Don't help me." She lay there soaked in sweat, gasping. Atlas stood beside her, body tense, alert, eyes locked on her face as if awaiting orders. Wheeler approached and knelt beside her to her arm. "Are you okay?" Becky typed on her tablet. "I failed." Wheeler shook his head, his voice stern but kind. "Failure is not coming back tomorrow. Today is a lesson." She blinked and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Wheeler placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You led your unit through Kandahar. Now we'll lead your body through this." Becky made slow but steady progress. 2 weeks later, she could stand unaided for 5 full seconds. When she did, the entire therapy room applauded, not out of politeness, but because they all knew what it meant, the first victory in a long war. That afternoon, Becky requested to speak with Wheeler privately. She sat in her wheelchair, tablet in hand, Atlas resting his head on her lap. She typed, "Why haven't you left my case?" Wheeler smirked. "You don't remember me, do you?" Becky looked up, her eyes widened. "Fallujah medevac chopper. You pulled me from a flipped Humvee. I thought I was dead." Her mouth opened, only a hoarse rasp came out. He nodded. "That was you. You saved me today. I'm just returning the favor." When Becky began to speak again, Wheeler was there, Atlas was there, Sandra was there too. "You can start with the name you know best." The speech therapist encouraged Becky turn to Atlas. She placed a hand on his head, then using all her strength, uttered a single word. "Atla!" Silence fell across the room. Then came the applause. Wheeler turned his face away to hide the tears in his eyes. There was something unspoken but understood by everyone present. Rebecca Lawson was back. Not fully yet, but the way she pushed through every therapy session proved one thing. War doesn't end when you leave the battlefield. It ends when you reclaim control over your own body. Wheeler left the room with a quiet smile. Atlas watched him go as if to say thank you. And Wheeler understood. They were a team, all 3 of them. There were no gunshots, no explosions, no enemies lurking behind mountain ridges. But for Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Lawson, every step, every lift of the hand, every syllable forced out of her throat was a battle. She had once led patrols through the Kandahar desert, survived ambushes and roadside bombs. But now it took her nearly a week just to bring a spoon to her mouth without spilling food. And with every moment of struggle, it felt as though she were screaming inside a body that had betrayed her. The irony was cruel. A woman who once kicked down steel doors with a single blow now couldn't turn the doorknob to a bathroom day 21 after the stroke. Rebecca was taken into the physical therapy room with one major goal since being hospitalized: to stand up unassisted for just 3 seconds. There was no medicine to help her now. Only relentless training, raw willpower, in the presence of Atlas, the only companion who hadn't left her side since the moment she collapsed. She stood between the parallel bars, gripping the rails so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her left leg trembled, refusing to cooperate. Her breath came in sharp gasps. Her back muscles were tense with effort. "Don't push too hard," said Johnson, the physical therapist. "We've still got time. Today doesn't have to be the day." Rebecca lifted her eyes sharp as steel. "Do it," she growled. Her voice was hoarse, broken, but each word landed like a military command. She removed her right hand from the bar. Her balance faltered. The entire room held its breath. 2 seconds, then 3, then 4, and then her left leg gave out. Atlas moved instantly, lunging forward to catch her before she could slam her head against the floor. "Got her!" Sandra shouted from a nearby chair. Startled but quick to act, Rebecca didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just lay there, teeth clenched, her eyes blank. Atlas placed his head gently on her chest, staring directly into her eyes. The therapist moved to lift her, but she raised a hand. "I need a minute, doctor." Wheeler entered just then, taking in the scene. "You stood nearly 5 seconds," he said. "That's not a failure." Rebecca didn't respond. She grabbed her digital board and typed each letter with such force her fingertips turned red. "Not enough. I don't want to just walk. I want to command again." Wheeler paused, then nodded. "Then we act like a unit. Develop a strategy, set objectives, allocate resources, and advance one position at a time." Rebecca looked up. A light flickered in her weary eyes. This was a language she understood. From that moment forward, rehab wasn't just a series of sessions. It became a tactical operation. Weekly goal walk, 10 steps without a cane. Monthly goal, teach a 5-minute lesson in a simulated classroom. Final goal, return to a real classroom before the fall semester. Atlas became part of every mission. He learned to walk precisely beside Rebecca's left side, helping her balance without needing parallel bars. When she wobbled, Atlas adjusted his body. When she gasped for breath, he nudged her hand gently his way of saying, "Keep going." "He's like a living radar system," Sandra observed during a session, detecting even the tiniest shifts in her mood. Wheeler nodded. "We call that biofeedback. But between them, it's something deeper. It's camaraderie. It's family." One day during a speech therapy session, the language pathologist handed Rebecca a simple script to read aloud. "Good morning, my name is Rebecca. Today I feel..." Rebecca stared at the paper. Her breathing was shallow. Her jaw muscles weren't cooperating. She tried, "Good morning, my name is R." She choked. Atlas licked her palm softly. Rebecca clenched her fist. Then slowly, haltingly, she spoke. "Rebecca, today I'm still fighting." A nurse in the back began to cry. Wheeler turned his head away, blinking fast. That night, Sandra joined Rebecca on the hospital balcony, the only place Becky said she felt truly at ease. Atlas lay sprawled at their feet. "People think you're a superhero," Sandra said softly. "You know that." Rebecca gave a faint smile, weak but genuine. "Even superheroes need a team," she whispered. "I'm just a soldier, and this battle is harder than any ambush I've faced." Sandra nodded. "But you're not fighting it alone." 1 week later, Becky walked 15 steps without a cane. 2 weeks later, she taught a 10-minute simulated lesson. Her breathing was still labored, her hands still trembled, but her voice was clear, strong enough to lead. 3 weeks later, Dr. Wheeler handed her a printed assessment. Rebecca Lawson, status, stable recommendation, return to work part-time. She signed it without a word. Atlas looked up, his tail swishing lightly. And then on a bright autumn morning, Rebecca Lawson walked into Carterville High School, a folder in hand, her steps slow but sure. Atlas walked beside her, eyes sharp as a bodyguard. Students parted to let her through. Then unexpectedly, the hallway burst into applause. A junior stepped forward, eyes shining. "You're the reason I signed up for the military," he said. Rebecca smiled. "I never left the team," she replied. "I was just on my way back." Before the stroke, Becky Lawson was the kind of person people respected, but few ever truly got close to. They admired her ramrod straight posture, the way she walked like the military was still stitched into her spine, and those bright, resolute eyes yet cold. To the residents of Maple Lane, she was like a walking fortress, strong, disciplined, and utterly self-reliant. But one day that fortress collapsed right in the middle of her living room. And the one who saved her wasn't a fellow soldier, but a grumpy woman named Sandra Lewis, who had once filed a noise complaint about Atlas's barking. And then the walls around Becky began to crack. After more than 2 months of rehab, when Becky could walk again with Atlas's support, she returned home one golden autumn afternoon. The house was the same clean, orderly, as though time hadn't dared to move anything. But the world around it had changed. Neighbors stood out on porches, some waved, some gave small nods. People who used to keep a 2-meter distance, both physically and emotionally, were now stepping a little closer. Sandra was the first to open the gate. "Welcome home, warrior," she said, holding out her hand. Becky gripped it slow but firm. Atlas stood beside her, tail swaying gently, eyes sharp as ever, still surveying every corner like he was on patrol. "I couldn't have done this without you," Becky said softly, her voice clearer now, after weeks of speech therapy. Sandra smiled. "And I would have never understood someone like you if I hadn't walked into that house on that rainy night." They both laughed, and in that moment, the invisible wall between them crumbled completely. The story of Atlas and Rebecca spread faster than either of them expected. A feature in the local newspaper detailed how a service dog saved his handler from a stroke and how a once distant neighbor became her rescuer. The story reached the neighborhood council, the same group that had once debated whether service animals and vests should be allowed in the park. Now Martha Greaves, the head of the neighborhood council and the woman who once called Becky a military machine disrupting the community rhythm, proposed hosting a Service Dog Appreciation Day. Right on the Maple Lane Green, Sandra, sitting in Becky's living room when the news broke, nearly dropped her coffee. "I never thought I'd live long enough to hear that come out of Martha's mouth." Becky shrugged. "Maybe she realized if it weren't for Atlas, I'd be dead, and maybe you've changed too," Sandra laughed. "I changed because of you, because of Atlas, and because of me. I'm tired of being on the sidelines." The event was held on a beautiful sunny day. People who once doubted service dogs now came with flowers and thank you cards. Children gathered around Atlas, allowed to pet him under Becky's watchful eye. On stage, the neighborhood council chair. Yes, Martha herself gave a tearful speech. "Today we're not just honoring a dog who saved a life. We're honoring courage not only on the battlefield, but in the battles of everyday life." The crowd applauded. Becky was invited to speak, but she kept it short. "I used to think I didn't need anyone. But when you're lying on your floor paralyzed and you hear the bark of the dog you once trained, you realize something. What keeps us alive isn't always strength. Sometimes it's connection." After the speech, a 6-year-old boy approached and handed Becky a drawing. It showed a woman with a cane standing beside a dog in a vest. Under the crooked crayon words, "You are my superhero." Becky was speechless. She hugged the boy. Atlas gently licked his hand. The ceremony ended, but the change didn't stop there. Sandra pitched a bold idea: a community class on service dogs, PTSD, and stroke first aid. At first, only a few signed up, but by the second session, enrollment had doubled. Becky was invited to teach the first class. She walked into the room and stood in front of 30 people, teenagers, seniors' parents. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Lawson," she began. "I once thought my mission ended when I left the military, but after my stroke, I realized I'm still fighting, this time for myself and for this community." The class ended with a live demo from Atlas, how to recognize signs of a stroke through behavior and physical cues. The entire room gave a standing ovation, not out of admiration for a soldier, but because they had just witnessed a woman who refused to give up and a dog who never left his partner's side. One evening, as Becky and Sandra sat on the porch, soft yellow lights glowing over freshly planted marigolds, Becky said quietly, "I think I've spent my whole life keeping people at a safe distance. I thought that was strength." Sandra nodded. "Me too. But maybe real strength is letting someone in." Becky was silent for a while. Then she turned and placed her hand on Atlas's head. "He came in when I couldn't even walk out." Sandra smiled and pulled a photo frame from her jacket pocket. "I have something for you. It was a picture Becky, Sandra, and Atlas taken the day Becky came home. Not a candid shot, a moment captured between a family not bound by blood, but by survival. Becky stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time in months, she laughed, a laugh full of breath and full of tears. A soldier can be trained to survive, but to truly live to love, to connect to be loved in return. Sometimes it takes a storm, a dog, a neighbor, and an entire community learning to see each other differently. And for Becky, her second chance at life was only just beginning. The first morning back at Carterville High School didn't begin with an alarm clock, but with a short bark from Atlas as if to say, time to return to the front lines. Rebecca Becky Lawson sat in front of her mirror. Her old military uniform had been replaced by a simple blouse, khaki pants, and a pair of sturdy medical shoes. She brushed her hair, now longer and softer than before, but her eyes still burned with determination. At her knee, Atlas looked up, his gaze steady, waiting. She wondered, would her students still remember her? Or had they forgotten the stern teacher who once made the whole class stand at attention during the national anthem? It didn't matter. She wasn't coming back to be remembered. She was coming back to live, to prove to herself above all that a stroke couldn't take away the resolve of a soldier. The school hallway buzzed like always. Students ran back and forth, sneakers echoing against tiled floors, laughter bouncing off the walls. But when Becky stepped through the front entrance, the world seemed to slow down, as if caught in a movie's slow-motion sequence. A nearby teacher held her breath. A student dropped his backpack, and then like a silent wave, the crowd parted, forming a clear path down the corridor. Becky walked forward slowly, each step a practiced effort in balance. Atlas moved on her left, scanning the environment, not just escorting, but guarding. The first claps came from the corner of Class 10B, and soon they rippled through the hallway. No one ordered it, no one suggested it. It just happened because everyone felt it was right. Principal Jefferson stepped out. Eyes misty, voice choked. "Welcome back, Major," Becky nodded. "Right where I belong." The first staff assembly of the year was held in the auditorium. All eyes turned toward the front row where Becky sat with Atlas by her side. When her name was announced, the entire auditorium rose. The applause thundered like an orchestra in perfect sync. Jefferson invited her to speak. Becky hesitated a moment. She had never feared public speaking, but today, with a still weak voice and a body not fully her own, every step, every word required thought. Atlas walked up with her. Each of his footsteps felt like a milestone. As she stood at the podium under the spotlight, the room fell completely silent. "Hello," she began, still hoarse but clear. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Lawson, former Marine Corps officer and history teacher at this school. This past April, I had a stroke. My body lost half its movement. I couldn't speak. I couldn't walk. I couldn't teach." A girl in the audience squeezed her friend's hand, eyes red. "But I fought to come back, not alone, with the help of doctors, co-workers, students, and this special companion." She looked down at Atlas. He looked up, eyes locked onto hers, as if he understood every word. "Today, I return not just as a teacher, but as a student of survival." This time, the applause didn't explode. It rose from the heart, deep, full, undeniable. Many stood, some wiped tears. That afternoon, Becky entered her first classroom, World War history. She paused at the door. The room looked smaller, not because it had changed, but because she had. She set her bag on the desk. Atlas lay down beside her chair, paws crossed like a soldier at rest. Students filed in. A few gasped. A junior boy murmured. "Ms. Lawson really came back," she smiled. "Do you know what we're learning today?" "About survival," one student replied. She nodded. "And about why we study history, because every loss with faith and comradeship can be rebuilt." At the end of class, a student approached her desk and placed a small package there. "What's this?" Becky asked, amused. "My mom used to be in your class. She said every first day back from break, she'd give you a little gift. Now it's my turn." Becky opened the box. Inside was a photo her and Atlas taken on the day she first returned to the hospital. I found it online, the student said. This picture, it gave me hope. Becky was quiet. Atlas rested his head gently against her leg. Thank you, she whispered. I needed hope once, too. That night in her journal, Becky wrote, I have survived the darkest days, not to return to who I was, but to move forward as someone better, softer, humbler, and more grateful. And the miracle is, it was my students who taught me that. Outside her window, moonlight bathed the rooftop where 2 years ago, she once stood alone, unshakable. Now on that same rooftop, she was no longer alone. She had Atlas, she had Sandra, she had a new community. She had a classroom that waited for her each day, and most importantly, she had herself.